So good morning, it's good to be with you today. I think in the previous conversation, you just heard how the line between public transportation and private transportation is going to be blurred in cities. I very much agree with that. And I think to figure out where that line is, we're going to have data to understand how people are moving around in our cities. That is the topic of the conversation I'd like to have with you today, and particularly diving into the data that we're able to access and not access today from the various private mobility services, ride hail, dockless bike share, dockless scooter, that are growing throughout cities in America, where I'm from. I live in Washington, D.C., here in Europe, and increasingly around the world. It may seem like a dry topic, but I firmly believe that this is actually critical to the future of our cities and designing our cities in a way that fulfills our social goals. And in the United States, I can tell you it's an extremely controversial topic, one that's actually something of a battlefield. And the American experience will form the basis of a lot of my remarks because I think there could be lessons here for Europe. I just took a dockless scooter here in Zurich, something I didn't expect to already be here after they've taken American cities by storm just in the last couple of months. So I'll dive right in. So a little bit about who I am and the perspective that I bring to these topics. I am a resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund, a think tank based in Berlin and in Washington, D.C., where I lead the Transatlantic Mobility Initiative, looking at how transportation is changing city lives in both the US and in Europe. I have a background working in cities themselves. I was in the Bloomberg administration in New York, and I led economic development strategy in Washington under two mayors, including, it was an exciting time to be there, both bike share and capital bike share, and ride hailing with Uber and Halo arrived at that time. So I have a whole other story that I could tell another time about that experience. But then more recently, for 4 years, I was managing director at 1776, a global startup hub based in Washington, where I led all work and investments through our venture fund in startups focusing on smart cities and mobility. So I approach these questions or issues around technology, cities, and data through the lens of a public official, but also from that of the startups that are playing a critical role in this space. And I think for context, let's just remember that for decades, until just about 10 years ago, when we talked about urban mobility, we're talking about a fixed number of services, right? You could drive, of course, you could maybe walk or bike, or you could be in a big metal box that is provided by public transportation, through a train, through a bus, through a streetcar, something like that. It's pretty much the same in 1998 as it was in 1968. But that's really different now. We have a whole array of new services that have popped up in the last 10 years, of course, starting with ride hailing, but we also have car share, we have dockless bike share, scooter share, electric bike share, and there's new services that are still yet to come as autonomous vehicles are ascendant and as electric batteries become more affordable of higher quality. We just heard a little conversation about that. And a lot of people are using these services. In San Francisco right now, at least 15% of all car trips taken are ride hail. And at least 9% of all trips, period, are ride hail. That doesn't even count all the bike share and scooter share trips as well. This is a really large proportion of the trips that are taken in cities in the US and to a growing extent here in Europe as well. And I want to make clear, I think a lot of good has come from them. We're still in the early stages, I think, of getting data about the impact of these new mobility services on our cities, but I can tell you from the American experience, at least, there's been some real good. Most obviously, we've had rather terrible taxi service in the United States for a long time, and ride hail has put a lot of pressure on them to provide higher levels of service and be cheaper. But there's other benefits too. Cities and public authorities have avoided expenses like building unnecessary parking garages by being able to arrange for partnerships with ride-hailing services. And there's been equity benefits too with the new services, for example, dockless bike share being used quite a bit by those who have lower incomes because they can pay maybe $1 or to use a service for an hour, whereas they wouldn't be able to afford the $80 or $100 up front to have a year subscription to a public service like City Bike in New York or Capital Bike Share where I live. And anecdotally, again, it's early, but anecdotally, it seems that with dockless scooter share, which is incredibly popular in the cities where it's launched in the last 60 to 90 days, it seems like there's a lot of diversity in the ages of people who use it. Old, young, middle-aged, in a way that didn't exist for other mobility services too. So this is all good stuff. But there's a lot we really don't know about what's happening on our streets due to these services and how we should respond. And I think maybe the best way to think about this is, if you bear with me, do a little bit of a thought exercise. Imagine that you are a benevolent city leader of your city's transportation services, and you're in your office and you have ride-hailing companies come in to meet with you, and they say, hey, look, in this particular intersection right here, there are all these bars and clubs. There's lots of people getting ride-hailing services, Uber or Didi Chuxing or Lyft, what have you, and it creates lots of congestion. You know it, we know it. There's potential for pedestrian injuries. So here's what you should do. Just take this parking spot right here and convert it to a pickup spot and a drop-off point for ride-hailing. Will you do that for us? So you want to do what's good for your city. Should you do it? You know that each one of these parking meters right here generates, let's say, 10,000 euro per year for your city. So there's a cost if you convert it. What's the benefit? Well, to know the benefit, you'll need to understand how many people are getting picked up or dropped off right there at that particular curb site. You'll want to understand how much circling is taking place, leading to congestion as these cars are looking to pick somebody up, right? And you want to know how long they're waiting at the curb to pick somebody up and at what hours. Can you get that data now? Maybe, if the ride-hailing companies are willing to provide it, but there's no baseline assumption that you can. That's a real issue. But I'll give you an even tougher scenario, because at least there in that previous one, you've got the city's interests and the ride-hailing company's interests aligned. What if, again, you're still that benevolent city leader, you want to make sure, as I think is entirely appropriate, I bet many of you will as well, that your ability to get one of these ride-hail vehicles is equal whether you're a minority or you're white, right? That seems like it's a reasonable role of transportation in cities. You shouldn't have to wait longer to get picked up if you happen to be African American or if you're Latino or you're from another race. How, as a city leader, are you going to know that unless you get the data and validated data from these companies? And it's not in these companies' interest necessarily to provide it, because it's all downside risk, right? In the best case scenario, it's equal and there's no story. And the worst case scenario, there actually is an issue, and then it's an ugly story for them. All right, let's move away from ride-hailing for a second. We can talk about dockless bike share. This is a scenario I've had many European friends talk about too, where you come across, as you're walking on a street, a tipped-over dockless bike share in the sidewalk. If I come across it, I move it to the side. It's a minor nuisance, and that's that. But what if I was in a wheelchair? What if I'm elderly with a walking cane? What if I'm pushing a stroller? What if, instead of this looks like it's sort of like a suburban street, what if it was on a sidewalk right next to a major hub for heavy rail, where as a transit leader, you're expecting people to be constantly rushing in and out? Now we've got a different situation. If you're a city leader, you know you're getting complaints about this anecdotally from residents, but how widespread is this as a problem? You can't know unless you're getting, again, validated data from the company about what's going on in the streets. And if you're responding to the rapid growth of dockless bike share, and in America now dockless scooters, by doing as Seattle's done, setting aside some space on the sidewalk or maybe in the street where these can be left away from where pedestrians are likely to be walking, where do you put them? How big should they be? How can you know if you don't have good data about how people are using these dockless bike share, dockless scooters in your street? Again, it's not provided. And this becomes a problem because as a city official through that exercise, the data here that's being collected from new mobility services is something of a black box. And as more and more people are using these services, it's becoming a bigger and bigger problem for those who want to set optimized policy for cities on how to use streets, how to think about regulating or taxing these new services. Now, I want to take a moment to give the perspective of the private mobility services themselves. I know a lot of leaders in these spaces. A lot of them really do care about the future of cities, and they have responses to these questions. What they say, at least when I talk with them most of all, is they say cities don't know what data they want. They just want everything. They just say, give me all the data, but then the cities don't know what to do with it. And so they turn right around and say, well, wait, come here and help me figure out how to use your data to answer the question that I have. That's not something that the companies have capacity to be able to do. And then, of course, there's the one-off requests where City A wants help with this data set, City B has a different question they're trying to solve, and again, it's not something that the companies are able to address. And of course, you hear all the time the ride-hail and the dockless scooter companies and bike share companies saying, well, we have to protect our passengers' privacy. That's why we can't share the data with government. We must make sure that privacy is protected. Personally, I'm a little skeptical of that because there's all kinds of sensitive information that's provided to government that we do all the time with taxation and other taxes and other ways. So let's just say there might be something else going here. But they have responses, and they sort of try. This is an example, probably the best known example is from Uber. Anybody here heard of Uber Movement? Thank you, Philly. Count on ITF. But Uber Movement is available only in a select number of cities around the world. But basically, it provides at a very aggregated level information about people traveling in Uber from this broad area of a city. In America, it's at the zip code level, to that zip code area of a city, the trip time, the routes that were taken, how much congestion there was. Sounds nice. It's gotten some okay PR for Uber, but it's generally useless to cities because you can't plug it in with the other data you're collecting from other mobility services, and it's not specific enough. Remember, this is at like a neighborhood level. How does this help you address at a neighborhood level the question about what to do with that parking meter at the curb? It really doesn't. So there's a big ways to go. And to be honest, there's a backlash growing in the US, and I'm interested, maybe we can talk about this afterwards, the extent to which you're seeing this here in Europe. But there's, in the public, a growing consternation with these services. There's concern that ride-hail in particular is responsible for a big problem in the United States where bus ridership is declining 5 to 6% per year in many cities. I think only Seattle and Houston are major American cities where bus ridership is growing. Everywhere else it's declining. You see cities also just banning outright dockless bike share, dockless scooters like Nashville and Miami Beach. Now, to be fair, some of these responses where cities are just banning them outright or responding in various ways, it could be overreaction. It likely is overreaction because you have some residents who just don't like how things or fear change, right? We've seen that before. But how do you really mount a response and explain how these services are improving cities if we don't have data that we're able to all agree is accurate to figure out the right answers? And the cities, frankly, aren't waiting to get this information from the services. They're moving on ahead. In the US now, New York City basically has said to the ride-hailing companies, you're going to give us detailed data or you're not going to be here. New York City is the biggest city in America that has the ability to do that because they've got the clout. We'll see how that plays out in other cities. Where I live in Washington, not as big a city, there's now a push to do the exact same thing. And as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner here, how are Uber and Lyft responding? Well, they say, oh, we can't give you the data because of privacy. Okay, maybe. There's other responses as well. There's an initiative called Shared Streets, some of you might know about, that's bringing together a bunch of cities with an association called NACTO, where they can come together and put their data in an aggregated way and sort of jointly compel the private services to share it as well. It's sort of working, it's sort of not. And then there's lots of data workarounds that cities are trying to figure out, sometimes in partnerships with universities. But the cities are moving on ahead, and the private sector is recognizing this has become a bigger deal. Remember, the number of people who are using these services overall, the share of trips that are being used by private services is growing. So we have startups like Populous that are aiming to provide this kind of analytics for public and private sources. You have Google or Alphabet offering a service called Cord through Sidewalk Labs. And Ford actually made a big acquisition a few months ago, a company called Automatic that provides sort of a mobility data service in the cloud, because they are aiming to be the utility provider for all this data in the future, serving cities themselves. But this is actually a point that I want to make sure I end on or emphasize. There's no assumption that cities or the public authorities are going to be the arbiters in the future of all this data and sort of guiding us toward the mode of transport for a trip within a city. In fact, there's evidence, for those who follow this space closely, that that's actually not the world that some of these companies want. Uber, a couple months ago, announced acquisition of a dockless bike share company called Jump that's very popular in the United States, as well as a partnership with Masabi that provides mobile ticketing on public transportation. And the Uber CEO very clearly, this is not speculation, he said, we want to be the platform for all your mobility needs within a city. Doesn't matter how you want to get around, come to the Uber app, we'll guide you. Lyft, Uber's big competitor in the US, which has international aspirations, wants to do the same thing. They just acquired Motivate, a major bike share provider, and they want to do something similar. So if you think about it, it's not impossible to imagine, it's not even unlikely to imagine a scenario where you have if you will, a constellation of services that's Uber, a constellation of mobility services that's Lyft, maybe a constellation that's Didi Xuxing or Lime or something like that. Then you have a public transit constellation of services. And you as a consumer would choose among them as you figure out your trip. Now that may be the outcome that optimizes returns for Uber, for Lyft, for a private provider. The question I would pose to all of us who care about mobility in cities is that actually optimized for city residents? Wouldn't it be better to have one place to go to know all the options that are available? And do we really want a private company to be nudging people this way or that way toward this mode versus that? And the point that I'll just end on is to just stress, I really think we're in the very early days of navigating this challenge. Like dockless scooters seem like they're just starting to arrive here in Europe. They really have taken San Francisco, Washington, Los Angeles by storm. Who knows what the next service is going to be? It could be partly autonomous. It could be a new form of electric mobility. Nobody would have expected the dockless scooters to be as popular as they are today a year ago. But if you agree that this world of private mobility services is going to continue to evolve, it's not going anywhere, then I would argue that we need to find a way of capturing the data from it and making sure that we as residents of cities all across Europe, and maybe the people from other parts of the world as well, are able to capitalize it to make sure that we're fulfilling our social goals in cities through data in both public and private sources. If you have any questions or like to reach me, my email address, Twitter handle is right here. I've actually written about this topic through a platform called CityLab, part of The Atlantic, a magazine that focuses on a whole array of topics. CityLab just focuses on cities, and I've written several articles about this exact topic of data mobility. I thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to the questions. Thank you.